All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We are very fortunate to have Professor Nick Evans here with us from the philosophy department at UMass Lowell. Nick has done seminal work in applied ethics on everything from healthcare ethics to dual-use research ethics to enhancement in the military work that has been in collaboration with the DoD. If I give a more extensive account of Nick's important work, our time for the talk is going to run out, so I won't. In addition to being one of the best applied ethicists out there, he's Australian and has a great Australian accent. So
which is always a good thing for a talk.
Into the bargain. So Nick, thank you so much for coming, and it's good to see you.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Oh, thank you. You shouldn't clap before I've disappointed you all in the talk. There's still so much time for me to change your mind about me. Well, thanks to Nia for this opportunity to talk. It's really nice to give a talk at a philosophy department. I do a lot more speaking to psychologists and clinicians than I do to philosophers, which has its perks, but also occasionally means that I find myself having to give like the children's book account of what philosophy is from time to time, which is actually kind of one of the inspirations of this talk, because I go to a lot of ethics meetings these days where I'm the only philosopher in the room. I actually had someone from the Air Force say, I didn't know that the Air Force funded philosophers, and I said, well, they don't, because that's a plural, they only fund one. That's me. He took that well, considering he actually has a DPhil from Oxford, so I guess they fund two. But he's on the payroll. So just to give you a quick disclaimer, I receive a considerable amount of money from the US government, some through the National Science Foundation, some through both the US Air Force and more recently the US Army Research Office, and I was also until recently a Greenwall faculty scholar, which is a private foundation that funds bioethics. It's one of the only bioethics private foundations out there, and so a lot of this work has come from all of these. My views do not reflect any of my funders, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or the US government, which is probably for the best right now, but we'll see how we go. So what I want to talk to you today about is I have been studying applied ethics since 2007, so we're going 17 years. My career is almost old enough to drink in Australia. It'll be a couple more years before it's old enough to drink here. And throughout that time, one of the things that I've struggled with as someone who wrote a dissertation about the right to freedom of speech is that what I did wasn't always ethics in the sense of moral philosophy, right? I did philosophy of law, I did philosophy of language, and I did a lot of political philosophy, and trying to establish in the course of my dissertation a scientist's right to freely express their ideas even when those ideas may have national security implications. So that was the subject of my dissertation, and a lot of that then focused on what is the role of science as an institution within a state, what is its relationship to federal funding of science, and of course to the national security apparatus. And so this talk is really me trying to reconcile some of these moments that I've had in my career so far with an understanding of what people call applied ethics, and then what people do in applied ethics, kind of on a day-to-day basis, and how we might draw from the tools of political philosophy to better do applied ethics. I don't want to say that I'm inventing something new. People have done this before at various times, but I think that the field as a whole could do with a turn towards some of the political philosophy methodology that I'm going to talk about here, in part because of the kinds of problems that we study in applied ethics. I think many of these don't really fall neatly into ethical theory, at least the way that I was taught it, and many of you teach it or are taught it. I notice that the students, I take it, are like real close right now, which is great, and then move on. So to the right, of course, at the very top is the kind of canonical cover of Hobbes's Leviathan. I recently published a book, and by recently I mean over a year ago, but and I'm happy to tell this story afterwards. I crashed my mountain bike in May of last year, and so there's like a 9-month period of 2023 that I don't really remember a lot of, and I crashed my mountain bike 2 days before this book came out, so I didn't get to do like a junket about it, but it was a largely kind of Hobbesian exploration of public health, And then the bottom, of course, are pictures of the so-called trolley problem, but in particular the way, kind of as it has evolved, this has become like a tool that has been used, especially in the ethics of autonomous vehicles, often until kind of the analogies that Foote and Thompson developed break into a million pieces because people extend the trolley problem well beyond the kind of limits of what those thought experiments were really designed to do. As someone who came to philosophy from physics, I'm actually a huge fan of thought experiments, so don't worry, this is not an anti-thought experiment screed, as has been done in other parts of the applied ethics literature recently. But rather, I understand, as someone who's come from physics, that thought experiments have like a really vital role to play, but they're also extremely specific in the kinds of work that they can do for us. So let me give you the problem, and this is actually where this paper started. It has since been rejected by 4 separate journals, and so I've kind of gone back to the drawing board because responding to my critics, I often realized that I was trying to explain a prior question that I hadn't answered in the course of trying to get that paper published, that I'm now trying to explain on its own before I then finally published that last paper in a grant that ended about 5 years ago. So the first grant that I was given here as a kind of a faculty member in the United States of America was through the NSF. I applied in late 2016, early 2017, and it was on the ethics of autonomous vehicle. That was the year that Tesla was really having a good go at trying to kill everyone that it could see with autonomous vehicles. It was a very fruitful time to be studying the ethics of autonomous vehicles because nothing makes money flow from the federal government like a crisis. And so I was given a small award by, it was a actually fairly big award at the time. My perspective has just changed since I started becoming a defense contractor. To study the ethics of autonomous vehicles, but to use experimental methodologies to try and break us free a little bit of the kind of quagmire at the time, which was that everything was kind of a riff on the trolley problem, right? So for those of you who aren't familiar with the deep dark past of the ethics of autonomous vehicles, there was a hot minute in 2016, 2017 where everyone was very upset about the possibility of an autonomous vehicle being engaged in an unavoidable collision either with an object, a person, or another vehicle, which would result in it having to make a series of choices which look very similar to the moral choices that are described in Philippa Foot's kind of seminal work on the doctrine of double effect in abortion, and then later Judith Jarvis Thompson's work kind of on the trolley problem, and then Jeff McMahon and Sobel and everybody else's kind of like variations on the trolley problem. So I got this money and then immediately regretted my life choices because I realized that I love the trolley problem. I love teaching the trolley problem. It's one of my favorite things to teach in undergraduate, introductions to ethics and introductions to philosophy. But I realized that I didn't want to spend 4 years of my life thinking about the trolley problem. And as someone who had recently immigrated from Australia, where we have 1/3 the per capita road deaths that America does, I started to become very frustrated with my colleagues who seemed very convinced that autonomous vehicles were the way to solve the road safety problem, right? So you had people like, I forget his last name, my colleague Don at the University of Notre Dame's Riley Center for Applied Ethics, saying that the 50,000 road deaths in America could be solved, if you will, if only we were all in fully autonomous cars that were going to drive us to and from work. Meanwhile, you had transportation engineers suggesting that it probably wasn't as simple as that. You had people like Patrick Lynn saying that environmental outcomes would be improved because congestion problems would be solved because of autonomous vehicles. And then you had people like Carol Vogaris saying that actually because autonomous vehicles remove the one current limiter on the number of cars you can have on the road is that you need a single person in each of those cars. Once you remove that final limitation, you could actually have infinite congestion because cars all of a sudden didn't need humans in them to be able to drive themselves, which then led to kind of some interesting implications for the number of cars that were going to be on the roads, the amount of emissions, and kind of so on and so forth. But me being, I know that kind of NEAR is part of a very techno-progressive group, as someone who has been called a Luddite both as a form of praise and as a pejorative, my response was, why don't...
I'm the Luddite on that group.
Well, you're the Luddite in that group.
They don't like me.
I'm a Luddite.
Well, as someone who comes from, the home of the union movement in Massachusetts, Lowell, I like to refer to myself as a Luddite but of the throwing yourself on the looms kind of Luddite, not the I'm scared of technology kind of Luddite. I'm not scared of technology, I'm scared of capitalists, and that's kind of why I'm a Luddite. So me being a Luddite, I was like, why why are we still obsessed with the personal automobile? Is it just that Americans can't not be about the personal automobile anymore, right? Like, are we too far gone? Has the is this the resolution of the Cold War, right? And we're just like doomed to, you know, I-93 forever. As someone who had to drive down I-93 to get here in the rain, with people from Massachusetts discovering for the first time in 6 months what it's like to drive in the rain. God, we give LA a run for their money around rain. One of the things that I noticed is that the fatality rates involved with public transit are orders of magnitude lower than they are for personal automobiles, right? So from a cost effectiveness point of view, you could, in principle, solve a good number of our deaths simply by replacing the kinds of transport that we take today, right? You don't need Elon Musk's company that he doesn't have any technical buy-in on, but the people that work for do, to finish finally developing their autonomous vehicles technologies, which they have been promising is going to happen any day now for about 10 years, in order to solve the road fatality crisis, right? And people do refer to it as a public health crisis. Rather, what you could do is you could just pump a bunch of money into Amtrak, right? You could reform the T. You could convince Americans that taking the bus is not for the poor, right? If you've ever been to another country, especially outside of North America, right? Canadians are at fault for this too. People in other countries take buses, right? I mean, it's a fascinating thing to do. I was in Geneva about 2 months ago, and I caught the bus out to Salève, which is on the French border, and I did some hiking, and I caught it back, and it was full of just like sweaty, beautiful people, right, who had all come from hiking these beautiful scenic mountains and then caught the bus home, right? They didn't get back in their SUVs to go home. And one of the reasons is that the chance that any one of you will die in a car accident is actually extraordinarily low. Right? One of the reasons that America has so many road deaths is that we drive collectively 3.2 trillion miles per year. So, at seven deaths in America per billion passenger miles, right? The chance, you shouldn't be a frequentist, you should be a Bayesian, but if you were going to be a frequentist, you would say that the number of miles you're going to have to accrue to get to one death for yourself is beyond the number of miles you will ever drive in your life. Right? Which of course doesn't mean that traffic accidents are fake. It just means that they're extremely widely distributed. They're also not evenly distributed because people who are of lower socioeconomic status tend to get into them more because they drive jobs that require them to drive more or drive at night. People of color, women, people with disabilities, traffic deaths kind of shape the contours of injustice in America the same way as most other forms of death, right? Not all forms of death, thanks to the opiate crisis, but most of them. And so what I came down on was the questions of what should my autonomous vehicle do? Or should I purchase an autonomous vehicle, and when should I purchase it? And what preferences should I give it, and how utilitarian should it be? These are not unimportant questions, right? I'm not here in this talk to tell you that any particular research program in philosophy is not important, especially because as an applied ethicist, I went through an entire 6 years at grad school at RSSS at ANU with other graduate students trying to convince me that what I did was not philosophy, right? So I'm extremely used to that game. I'm not here to play that game with anyone. What I am trying to say is that there is an entirely separate set of problems that autonomous vehicles raise that actually have nothing to do with individual decisions, right? And if they do have anything to do with individual decisions, it's in the ways that those individual decisions then manifest at the basic structure, right? Or at the ways that we shape regulations. And so what I want to do today is go through 3 case studies where I think political philosophy gives us more tractable and interesting ways to think about these problems than traditional kind of normative ethics and moral philosophy. Now, with that in mind, and this is kind of speaking, of course, to not just the students, but the faculty who's probably have come up with this problem. Moral and political philosophy are, of course, extremely fungible subfields of philosophy that share norms, that share genealogies, that share concepts, and so on and so forth, right? If you ask utilitarians, they are much more happy with the idea that political philosophy is just moral philosophy with extra steps. If you talk to kind of our less teleological colleagues, they have slightly different answers to that question. So what I want to do is just separate out the idea that we can have debates in applied ethics about what our substantive moral views permit us or prohibit us from doing in particular considerations around science and technology. And then we can have questions about the arrangements of states, the basic structure of communities, of peoples that are different but related to those initial prior questions. So there is some coherence between these two fields, but not always. So, obviously Rawls did a ton of work at trying to separate these two things out. I'm not going to say that you should believe him, but you could also imagine, that like the way that Philip Pettit's civic republicanism manifests and the way that he kind of restricts certain aspects of cognition when we're thinking about substantive moral views to get to his political beliefs is also another way of trying to separate these two things out. Lee Werner, as well as, for the students here, writes an amazing Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on John Rawls, and he kind of identifies these 4 roles of political philosophy that Rawls picks out, which is that political philosophy allows us to establish grounds for reasoned agreement in the face of conflict around our political institutions. It allows citizens to orient with their social world. The degree to which political philosophy achieves that goal with the polis in general is up for debate. It allows us to, and I think this is one of the more interesting ones, to probe the limits of political possibility. And then it also allows us to reconcile our understanding of our times with higher order theories, or not, depending on how you feel about this current political moment. And it also allows us to answer practical questions as well as kind of abstract descriptors of the state. So Danny Wenner has done a lot of work on the roles that different concepts of freedom play in medicine recently. Helen Froh has done a lot on armed conflict. Lee Werner on trade and post-apartheid, like everything from oil markets to post-apartheid diamonds. Michael Moeller at Virginia Tech recently has written a number of really compelling papers on universal basic income from his kind of neo-Hobbesian perspective. And then, of course, people like me, to give myself a tiny little plug here, writing more recently about how you justify public health as an institution of the state rather than merely thinking about it as a set of ethical decisions that individuals make. Because as I try to establish in that book, the idea of individuals making public health decisions absent any larger kind of basic structure is nonsense in some ways, right? You can't do public health as individuals, no matter what the neoliberal people want to tell you. So that's kind of where I'm starting here. And what I want to then do with the rest of my time is really talk about these 3 problems as I see it in applied ethics that we can get additional traction on if we start to dip into some of the tools of political philosophy. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the way that we think about regulation and public policy. And I'm going to use my recent work on human enhancement. Behind the title card there, of course, is Captain America, the poster child for human enhancement. And then I'm going to talk about population-level benefits and risks from my work in biosafety and the limits of research in the biological sciences. So down in the bottom right is the Needle, which is out in Jamaica Plain. It's this high-containment infectious disease laboratory that for about 15 years was a subject of extreme controversy here in the city of Boston, because it turns out that people living in southern Boston, especially people who can afford to live in Jamaica Plain, weren't super happy with the idea of a bunch of Ebola being stored next to their very expensive houses. And then I'm going to finish off with a bit of discussion about artificial intelligence, because I'm an applied ethicist in 2024, so how could I not talk about artificial intelligence? I have a wage to earn. So let me start with regulatory processes. So coming up in applied ethics, and being an Australian in applied ethics, where you are required to read more than a healthy amount of people like Julian Savulescu and Peter Singer in order to finish your comps, many applied ethics debates go something like this. Take some X. It's a medical intervention, it's a technology, it's a piece of scientific discovery. And then we ask the question, should we, or should anyone, X, right? Should you genetically engineer yourself? Should you take that pill? Should you accept that organ? Should you be given access to a liver transplant if you're an alcoholic? And so on and so forth, right? So I call this the prior question. I actually have a book contract with Oxford University Press for on the ethics of super soldiers that was being co-published with my former postdoc, Blake Harris, and we were required by OUP to input 2 chapters on this prior question, should anyone enhance anybody? And I had a big fight with the editors because I was like, do I have to? Like we've done it. Like, I promise you it's been done. And they're like, no, you need to do it. I'm like, all right, it's your book that no one's going to read. Sorry, students, this is my views on edited collections in philosophy. I have really big feelings about them, but my postdoc really wanted one, and I'm a generous mentor, if you will. And then once you've answered the prior question, right? Once you've said, should anyone X? You then often ask, under what whys may we X, right? So I call this the permissibility question, right? So, okay, so you can undergo germline gene editing, but can you undergo germline gene editing if it's going to interfere with your IQ? We don't know about that. That gives us the ick. You can tell I've been hanging around Gen Z way too much. The Gen Z brain rot right now in my body is just, I have so many really talented undergraduates who work for me at the moment, and they're all just, the ways that they talk, they may as well be speaking Dutch. And
bioethics phrases yuck.
Yeah. The wisdom of the ick, right? To kind of, will be the reissue of Leon Cass's famous wisdom of repugnance, but because it's Gen Z, it'll be like the wisdom of the ick, or it's giving ick. I think is the best way to say it. So you can do germline gene editing fine, but you can't do it on intelligence because we have concerns about inequality, or we have concerns about eugenics, but you can do it for Huntington's disease, right? So people go, well, germline gene editing for the purposes of eradicating Huntington. There's no one with Huntington's, Carrera, who's really like, oh no, you need to keep me like you need to keep people with my disease around. If the next generation can be born with it, everyone's like, fine, get rid of it. I have yet to meet a person with Huntington's, Carrera, or with the genetic markers for Huntington, Carrera, who's like, no, germline gene editing is a bad idea. But when you get to like intelligence, skin color, eye color, other things, people start to get a bit worried. And so we then have this permissibility question. The obvious case then is human enhancement. This is a bottle of modafinil. I am very experienced with modafinil at this point. It's fun. It allows you to stay awake for a very long period of time without the experience of being fatigued. It is not like an amphetamine. It doesn't get you wired. You just don't get tired. It's a very weird process. Far less is accomplished on, there was meant to be another word in there, is like on the how, right? So let me explain why the how is super important. If you wanted to, say you are one of these techno-progressives that Nia has to endure as the Luddite in his center, right? And you're just really into the idea of putting a chip in your brain that'll allow you to access the cloud and upload your consciousness and back yourself up and all these fun things that people like Nick Bostrom talks about. How do you get access to one of these? Well, right now you don't, because they don't exist, right? And the ones that do exist, we only give to people, for example, with extreme versions of quadriplegia to allow them to communicate with the outside world or to drive a wheelchair, things like that. But say you wanted to do this with people who don't have quadriplegia, and so you roll up to the UMB IRB, I am the chair of the UML IRB, you're like, look, I've got a population of healthy volunteers, 50 of them, and I want to crack open their skulls and put a chip in their brain and see if they can, I don't know, fly a drone with it. What do we think the IRB is going to tell you? Absolutely fucking not. Why? Because the risk to benefit ratio that the IRB is going to look at for a non-therapeutic surgical intervention is going to immediately make them laugh their way to the bar, right? This is a non-starter for IRBs. Now, that's not because the common rule prohibits research unless there is a clinical therapeutic intervention, right? The common rule says nothing about enhancement. It was written in 1979, right, when we didn't really even think in terms that we do now. It's just that IRBs as a professional group of people are not in the business of allowing human enhancement research. The only human enhancement research they do allow is for things like this. We have a literature review ongoing with one of those Zoomer students that I was previously mentioning at the moment of 900 caffeine studies, where we're just trying to work out what the primary and surrogate endpoints are for measuring performance against which you would measure enhancement, right? It turns out that is a really interesting philosophy of medicine problem that I won't get into. But the upshot here is that if any of you wanted to get really into human enhancement, you're actually stuck because your ability to generate robust scientific knowledge is kind of limited to what you can do to yourself. So if you're a biohacker and you want to start injecting stuff into your body, go for your life. But anyone who knows anything about science will tell you that's not really doing science, right? That's not getting us to Altered Carbon or the Matrix or Blade Runner or whatever your your version of a post-human future looks like, right? And so I can't, even modafinil, right, a compound that the US Air Force prescribes to pilots to keep them awake during long-distance flights. The number of clinical studies that have been done on this drug is extremely small. It's about half a dozen, right? The sample sizes that we're talking about are a couple of dozen people per arm. You contrast that to a vaccine study where it's like an N of 30,000, right? The kinds of scientific information we're generating about human enhancement are almost nothing. And so one of the things that applied ethics has kind of forgotten is how do you actually construct a version of the FDA that allows you to do human enhancement research? What would it even look like to submit an IND or an INE for a human enhancement drug to the FDA? Now, right now, the way that they do it is they classify the thing that they want to enhance. They classify its absence as a disease for the purpose of curing it, right? So the reason that people can market Botox for cosmetic purposes on TV, so, you know, because I study human enhancement, I get a lot of Botox ads on Hulu because it's like, well, this guy is clearly needs some injections. The way that Botox was approved at the level of the FDA for pre-market authorization, right, for the purposes of getting it onto a TV screen, was they had to classify fine lines as a disease that Botox was intended to cure. So in order to get the FDA to play ball with them, they had to classify wrinkles as a disease for the purposes of curing it with their drug, Botox, right? They're not talking about you can stay young forever and that's an enhancement, right? They're talking about you are diseased, right, with the curse of fine lines, the thing that happens to everyone, and we have a solution for you. So, for many applied ethics questions that focus around the prior and the permissibility questions, the answer to can anyone X ever, I find, is rarely no, right? There are not a lot of times in applied ethics where people really get the in-principle prohibitive stance on something, right? You know, Marcy Darnowski and her crew on human enhancement are probably like a good exception where they've really kept going despite all odds. The more important question is thus, what do people want to use it for, and how do you establish a system such that our permissible uses are regulated in certain ways and our impermissible or very risky uses are regulated in other ways? And this fundamentally is a question of institutional design, right? Because instead of having a in principle should you or shouldn't you question, you have a series of people with plural and conflicting goals who all want access to this for slightly different reasons, or access to different human enhancements for different reasons. A student of mine is currently writing an undergraduate thesis on the way that that specialization works in cases of human enhancement, because he doesn't buy the idea that we would all want the same human enhancements all at the same time, right? And so he wants to look at what specialization within political economy does to the question of human enhancement. So instead of should you take the drug, should you get the shot, should you put the chip in your brain, we instead need to ask questions about how do you actually establish a system for authorizing certain kinds of uses and understanding the risks that come with those uses in a way that is politically justifiable. And I don't think that that's an applied ethics question in a general, like kind of in like a tight sense. I think that this then draws in questions of political feasibility, it draws in questions of value conflict and pluralism, and it draws in questions of like what is the appropriate legislative mechanism by which to do that. Do we rely on the judiciary and kind of think of like an overlapping consensus arrangement, or do we rely on a legislature and take a slightly different arrangement? So that's what this slide was about, right? The other thing to understand that I'll finish this one on is mechanisms of action in medicine are not the same as performance. And so the other problem that you have with getting things through the FDA is that if you get a staph infection and you get given an antibiotic, the medical outcomes and the mechanisms of action track each other extremely closely, right? You have bacteria that's in your body that shouldn't be in your body, and the condition of success is the absence of that bacteria in your body, and we have a weird form of fungus that we've distilled into an antibiotic that is going to solve your problems for you. If you talk to the people who do sleep studies for the Air Force, the mechanism of performance is really, really tricky, because for a start, they're not doing randomized control trials on people who fly FAA teams in combat while they're on combat, right? They're not going to the Air Force and they're like, here, take this pill. Is this pill going to keep me awake, or is it made of sugar? I don't know. You and the people you're about to shoot a missile at are about to find out, right? That's not how we do this. So establishing proxy variables for performance is actually a much more difficult problem than it is in clinical medicine. And this is, again, you can imagine trying to get a political enterprise to sign off on different kinds of performance metrics is actually going to be a complicated political task and not merely an applied ethical task. So that's the first case study where I think that questions of political feasibility, questions of philosophy of law, and then questions of philosophy of medicine as it is applied to regulation can really help our applied ethics case. So we can get off the ground from should we be enhanced or not to what would a meaningful pathway to some enhancements start to look like. The next one I want to talk about is population level risks and benefits. And I foreshadowed this with the autonomous vehicles discussion. Emerging technologies frequently involve population level risks and benefits. And what I mean by that is that there are lots of individual risks and benefits that we take all the time, but there is also a social distribution of risk that might incur to us where the kinds of actions that we take have downstream risks that are either not immediately apparent to us, or even if they are apparent to us, are not readily calculable by us. So again, I took my life into my own hands today to get here because I had to drive on State Route 3 and then Interstate 95 and then Interstate 93 to get from Lowell to UMass Boston, right? I do not spend my time on the road calculating the a priori risk that I bear on every single driver that I am engaged with at every single time. Nor could I, because if I get myself into a crash on the turnoff from 95 to 93, which is always where I feel I'm going to crash, then I can't know what people 6 cars behind me are going to experience in terms of their risk differential. Engaging and driving on the road is an engagement in the public distribution of risk and the social assignment of risk on a very, very high level, right? And that does just include the immediate kinetic risks of driving in the car. It includes noise and air pollution. It includes the disjuncture of communities when we lay down new roads and new highways. There are all of these stories that you can read. There's a book called Transportation Injustice, which you should read if you are interested in this, where they talk about how different strategies of cutting up cities using the first interstates had differential outcomes for communities depending on where you sat the road, right? So, and they have different kind of case studies as you go up, which of course, follow the contours of institutional racism in the 1940s and 1950s in America, to no one's surprise. So, in the case of emerging technologies, you can talk about individualized prior or permissibility questions and the risk associated with those, right? If I jump on the internet and start entering my credit card information, what is the a priori risk that someone's going to take all my money, right? But it makes sense to do so in the less of, for example, low probability, high consequence decisions. This is where the predictability of our statistical lives, so our ability to know how many future people or how many unknown people might be hurt by us, is extremely hard to calculate, because the chance that I'm going to hurt anyone is very, very low, but the chance that if I do hurt someone, I'm going to hurt a lot of people all at once is very, very high. The availability of certain kinds of benefits and the kinds of those benefits across a population. Then, of course, the accessibility of ways to mitigate the risks that might flow from these population level benefits and risks. Libertarian versus liberal conceptions of risk tolerance, right? So what does the non-aggression principle that is favored by libertarians say, and how does the metaphysics of libertarianism account for long-term risks versus, for example, social risk sharing under liberal schemes versus communitarian schemes? And then the liabilities of different levels of political community to solve those kinds of risks, right? The most obvious example being the state and federal governments cover the liability for vaccine adverse events, because if pharmaceutical manufacturers had to pay out damages every time someone has an allergic reaction to a vaccine, no one would ever make vaccines, right? And it was understood that until very recently, unfortunately, that the risks of not having vaccines because there were no economic incentives to do so were much, much worse than the benefits of getting access to those vaccines and paying for the tab for any injuries that they very occasionally cause, because, of course, vaccines are not perfectly safe because nothing is perfectly safe. So let me give you an example from my life. And I am sorry to say that this unfortunately is a lot of my life right now because Rand Paul exists, and he's on a tear right now, and so I have reporters call me a lot about this. So just down the road, as I said, is the Needle, right? The New England Infectious Disease Laboratory. It's an extremely well-secured, safe facility that does work with some of the world's most dangerous pathogens. Ebola, Marburg, the various equine encephalitises. I mean, it does work with COVID, but COVID's not the worst thing that nature has in its arsenal by any means. It's kind of the my first pandemic version of infectious disease. And imagine that you, an aspiring scientist, wanted to do some work with Ebola, and then you ask the question, should I build a new high containment lab? I want to say that question, as like an ethical question, doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? And one of the reasons that it doesn't make a lot of sense in isolation, right, is that there are very few people who can just show up and be like, I want a new high containment lab, right? The Gateses, the Bezoses of the world, probably. And so they may be in a position to individually ask this question, but even if you had all of the resources to do so, I think that the ways that safety and security work in high containment lab don't lend themselves to individual ethical analysis particularly well. And that's because if an accident occurs, and the kinds of accidents I'm talking about were the subject of my dissertation and then the subject of my career since, so-called gain-of-function experiments, which some of you have probably heard of right now because there's a lot of tourists in my little area of bioethics, is when you take, for example, an influenza virus that doesn't currently transmit in humans, it only transmits in birds, and you modify it so that it can transmit in mammals, right? Now, if that virus escapes from the lab, bad things could happen, right? So 59% of all people who have contracted H5N1 have died. Now, it is not believed that a H5N1 pandemic in humans would kill 60% of the human population, but the estimates are between 14 and 33%, which, given that COVID only had a fatality rate of 1%, right? Imagine 14 COVID simultaneously. That's a really big problem, right? But the chances that you're going to lose this bug from the lab are extraordinarily small, but the risks, if you do, are extraordinarily high, right? Now, here's the really interesting thing. Mark Lipsitch at Harvard and Owen Cotton Barrett at Oxford and I, a couple of years ago, published a philosophy of economics paper where we looked at the incentives for trying to mitigate what we called these extremely unpredictable risks, so extremely low probability, extremely high. If you are in like a publish or perish world in virology, and you want to be the guy with his experiment on the cover of Nature, and no one else is stopping doing this kind of research, even though it poses certain kinds of material risks to the populations, we've been able to show that except for very, very strong incentives that are imposed on you otherwise, you don't really have an economic incentive as a rational actor to stop doing this research. Why? Because the costs of you doing it to yourself are very, very high, and the probability that you personally are going to be responsible for the end of the world is very, very low, right? So from like a rational decision theory, you can imagine, the utility calculations that go into this, and you're like, look, it's just much better for me to have a paper in Nature, right, and make a little progress in science, because the chances that I'm actually going to kill 14% of the world are extremely, extremely low, right? So instead, what we need to understand is a way that we distribute the social risk that goes with this, because on top of the blanket risk of a 14% pathogen breaking out all over the world is the fact that, as we know from COVID and we knew from 1918 Spanish influenza, so-called Spanish influenza, the ways that people die in pandemics are not evenly distributed, right? You are more likely to die if you have a disability. You are more likely to die if you are African American. You are also less likely to get access to any therapeutics that we develop to stop this pandemic disease if you are disabled, if you are African American, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So you are on the hook for all of the risks and none of the benefits. And these experiments are going on around you in major cities like Baltimore and Boston and New York. Occasionally not in major cities, because we do things like we put labs on islands off the coast of Long Island Sound where they belong, right? But what you end up with is you end up with a question about the social distribution of risk, right? Which on its face looks a lot more like a question that you would apply, for example, the Maximin principle to, right? You know, are these kinds of inequalities justifiable if, for example, they benefit the worst off? And what would it mean for the arrangement of scientific benefits and risks to be that benefits the worst off? Does it include these kinds of research? And if it does, how much of this research should be done and where should it be done, and so on. So now you have a case where you are trying to decide what the scientific landscape has to look like, potentially not even in the United States, but globally, right? There are only something like 35 of these high containment labs all over the world, and 20 of them are in the United States. But post-COVID, lots and lots of low and middle income countries are starting to develop their own high containment laboratories because they have learned the hard way that the West is not coming to save them in the event of a pandemic, and they want their own infrastructure. So now all of a sudden what we have is we have a proliferation of these laboratories, and it's very difficult to ask, again, as I said, the individualized question, should I build this lab? Instead, what you need to ask is, how many labs should there be, and where should they be, and what should they be studying as a global enterprise? All right, so I want to finish with my favorite topic in ethics and political philosophy, rights, which is really funny given that I started off as a utilitarian way back in the day. So one of the things that happens in applied ethics a lot is that we start to get new kinds of rights getting bandied around. As a student of the late Tom Campbell, I am extremely skeptical about what happens when people start to throw new rights around, or when they start to use new rights in interesting ways. So I have a number of friends who are well placed in the neuroethics community. I don't do a lot of neuroethics myself, but they have things like a right to cognitive liberty. And my first question is always, what is that? And is it a right? And if it is a right, what kind of right is it? So the other one that we've seen more recently is, of course, Mark Zuckerberg's famous contention that privacy is dead, right? And that privacy rights no longer exist. And that obviously puzzled a lot of people because it seemed really weird for a tech mogul to simply proclaim the end of an entire conception of rights. But one of the things that emerging technology often prompts us to ask the question of is, what kinds of rights are there? Are they natural rights? Are they positive rights? Are they basic rights, or are they derivative rights? Are they liberty rights, so rights to be free from something, or are they welfare rights? Are they rights to certain things? And then there is this larger question, because it is very rare that people want to invoke rights as purely individualized notion, right? Where they're like, well, part of my moral system is I understand that I have this set of rights, right? Often rights are couched, as I think they should be, in more explicitly political terms, right? What kinds of rights are instantiated within political community? You know, if you read the thinkers of the early modern period, they actually thought that very few rights adhered to us as human beings. Most of the rights that we understand come as a function of our governance systems, and as a function of our political community. So if you have a right to cognitive liberty, right, did we have a right to cognitive liberty when, you know, Hobbes was writing or Locke was writing? And if we did, is it only that we're just realizing these new threats to cognitive liberty? Or is cognitive liberty, for example, a right to autonomy, right, in the way that James Griffin might describe it, right, that we're just having pushed upon by new kinds of technologies, right? So cognitive liberty isn't really a thing as a right. We just have rights to autonomy, and brain-computer interfaces are interfering with our autonomy rights in new and exciting ways, but they aren't creating new rights. So I'm really interested in privacy rights, especially because I was, again, a Luddite when personal genomics came to be a thing, and I was told by all of my very well-meaning colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, which is where I did my postdoc, that I was just worried way too much about these tech companies collecting all of this genomic information, right? Because they had done studies which showed that people were actually really comfortable, to which I said, you can't do a study only with employees of personal genomics companies about how comfortable they are with personal genomics, because that's probably not a valid sample for the rest of us. One of the most famous of these studies was done with the employees of Illumina who make the sequencer that 23andMe uses. And of course, they were really thrilled with personal genomics. Why? Because they were getting really nice bonuses from selling this stuff to the guy who started Google's wife, and Wojcicki. So, one of the things that we have learned since the digital age has come about is that it's not that there is a new form of privacy that exists, but that we misunderstood the way that privacy rights worked, right? So we often understood privacy to use a now unfortunately defunct legal case, Roe versus Wade, as the right to be let alone, right? But recent scholarship by people like Daniel Solove has described privacy rights as one that is not individually held. And the reason for that is that my privacy rights don't necessarily, if my privacy rights bear on my personal information is extensional within my community, right? So you can violate my privacy rights, and you have responsibilities to uphold my privacy rights in terms of knowing certain kinds of personal information about me, right? And I have to share that personal information for a whole bunch of reasons, but that means that because of the extensionality of my data, these privacy rights can become overlapping and a little bit more amorphous than, for example, bodily autonomy rights, because bodily autonomy rights, there's just one of me, unless, of course, the techno-progressives get their way, in which case I will be cloning myself as soon as I possibly can, because mostly I'll be doing that really terrible thing they do in science fiction. I'll be cloning myself to get my own organs so that I can repair some of the damage that I've done to myself from a life in extreme sports. I feel sorry for Nick number 2. He's really just a vat of organs in my mind. So these are not atomic cases, but moreover, these privacy rights rely on state liability to uphold, right? So the state is liable for preserving some of your privacy rights by enforcing certain limitations on other individuals, actors, and firms in order to protect your data. And moreover, your personal data in the age of genomics, for example, is not just your data, right? Why? Because you have family who are genetically related to you, for which your personal data can inform their material futures, right? My close family had a very, very upsetting discussion about this a couple of years ago, because my wife, who is also a bioethicist, was like, please, my family, do not go into 23andMe. I'm begging you, this is not a good idea. Eventually they're going to run out of money and they're going to sell your data to the highest bidder, which is what they are doing literally this year. And then without her knowledge, her brother went off and got himself sequenced. And so she started getting emails from 23andMe because they had found her based on her genomics being like, hey, do you want to add to our roster, right? So your genomic data is not actually just your genomic data, it is partly your family's genomic data, which makes the privacy implications even more complex. I don't think that privacy is dead. But what it means to instantiate privacy rights in a digital and genomic age, I think is a very different political question than it was in a pre-genomic and digital age. I'm not going to say that there were no privacy concerns before the internet. It's just that the ways that the state has to react to respond to some of those privacy rights, I think, has changed. And now this then broaches a political philosophical question about what the state's responsibility for maintaining your privacy is, but then also a much deeper, I think, political philosophical conversation about what kind of good data is. So for the grad students who haven't been exposed to quite as much Rawls as I make my students read, right, we have different kinds of primary goods, right? And I think that most people for a long time have thought about data as like a material primary good, right? So it's like currency, right? You can earn money with it, you can sell it, you can buy it. But we are increasingly understanding data in terms of opportunities, right? The kinds of data that you have access to and who has access to your personal data do in fact change the way that you can manifest opportunities within the society that we have. We see this a lot, for example, with algorithmic hiring practices. You know, these are algorithms that will take your CV, but then they will match it to your LinkedIn profile, and they will try and figure out if you're a good candidate for the job. Surprisingly, these algorithms tend to be quite racist. So when we think about what kind of good data is, including its transferability, its excludability, then we have to start having these larger conversations about how we regulate the access to that data as a way of distributing goods within society, right? Because if we're just distributing material goods, that's one set of understandings of our political kind of obligations. But if we're distributing opportunities in the way that we understand the distribution of data, then all of a sudden we have a different set of distributive justice priorities. Because for some political theories, the way that we distribute material goods versus opportunities comes apart. So how we select our political theory now bears on the way that we understand data. All right, finishing up. So here's kind of where I'm at with this project, which is that when new technologies arise, they can shape the access and entitlements we have to our basic liberties at times. Think, cognitive liberty, if that is a real thing. But they can also change our distribution of primary goods and opportunities in society. Put in other ways, emerging technologies don't just change it doesn't just change a life or lives, it can actually change the basic structure, right? So the world before sea travel was a very different economic world and a very different political world to the world after sea travel, right? The world pre the internet was a very different world in terms of the way that opportunities are shaped post-internet. This doesn't mean that all political philosophical ideas are changed by the emergence of new technologies, and it would obviously change depending on the kinds of technology that we're talking about. So I have a student who, for his capstone last semester, he wrote about the way that the savings principle in Rawls bears on the possibility of an interstellar political community, right? So the idea that colonizing Mars might actually have implications for the savings principle, because all of a sudden you have these two extremely separated political communities where the transfer of goods and opportunities between them is not only not negligible, it's extremely prohibitively costly, right? And so the way that you understand what Rawls has to say about the costs of managing equality versus utility actually start to fall apart under certain circumstances. So you could have really big challenges to the basic structure, or you could just have little challenges to the way that we institute regulations, the way that we think about legislation. So I think the internet has reduced communications costs and had a radical increase in the way that we make availability of data. It has also changed the way that we geographically distribute communities, because all of a sudden community is not necessarily bound by the geographic constraints of who you can see and touch and yell at. And it also changes access to means of information distribution, the speed at which you can distribute information, the speeds at which you can close off information, and the speeds at which, and the relative difference between those two things. And if societies are in part, as some people believe, informed by signaling, right? So Hobbes has an entire series of chapters on the way that signaling works between animal kingdoms and then between humans and rational agents, then maybe the internet might not have preserved the basic structure as we understand it, because we've changed the way that we do signaling in the form of communication. And then we have the separate thing, which is what happens when we introduce artificial agents, and what are their roles in now a bifurcated kind of two-species society, where we have artificial agents on the one hand and human agents on the other, which presumably would have implications for the way that we structure opportunities and liberties as well. So some people have started to make inroads to this, but I think that political philosophy has a lot more to contribute to applied ethics than it has in the past. And I'm hoping that by starting this discussion that more can be done to understand emerging technologies in political contexts, as our colleagues in sociology and STS want to do, but using the tools of philosophy rather than the tools of those other disciplines and letting them have the monopoly on these kinds of questions as they stand. So that's me, and I would love to take your questions. Go back here to my front screen. Hi.
Hi. I loved your talk. It's great. When you were talking about the human enhancement and your approach to these kinds of questions, something that we've been talking about in our group and that I think is kind of definitive of a techno-progressive approach, which is the problem of two cultures. That basically you have STEM folks saying, here's what we're trying to build, and look how good it works. And then the non-STEM folks, the humanities and social science folks, say, this is the 10 reasons why we need X that you're trying to build. And you're saying, why don't we start from the assumption, if you were to build X and it were to solve all of these problems, what would that look like?
Right.
How would you do that? And I just love that approach because it opens it up to the regulatory question, makes it a practical political question. But it also underlines for people that a lot of their reactions are ick reactions. They're motivated reasoning backwards to say this is the reason why this technology should never be used.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing is, it's one thing to say, I personally would never X, right? So I had a conversation with a student yesterday who had just gotten into motorcycles and had done what a lot of people do when they get into motorcycles, which is immediately break their shoulder. They were saying, well, you like to go fast. Do you ride motorcycles? And I said, no, I don't want to motorcycle, right? I prefer my danger to come from my own two legs. And that's not because I'm anti-internal combustion engines. That's just because I have personal preferences about the ways that I like to damage my body for sport, right? And take risks with my own body. And I think that's a very different thing than saying no one should X, right? Now, I work in biological weapons non-proliferation. I do believe that there are some things that we should never X, right? 100% lethal versions of smallpox. I'm not going to say, oh, well, maybe there's someone. No, I'm sorry. Even like the Bostrom kinds who are like, but what if aliens? And I'm like, come on. We don't even know that orthopox viruses are going to be able to attach to them. We're more likely to murder ourselves than we are to murder the aliens.
Worked in War of the Worlds.
What?
It worked in War of the Worlds.
It did work in War of the Worlds, but I believe that was the common cold. And look, if that's all it takes, then we are. Because humans are filthy. The first time one of us gets abducted by those aliens, like that alien civilization just collapses. Maybe that's the solution to the Fermi paradox. Every time someone gets abducted by aliens, they immediately get one of our germs. The entire civilization dies, and that's why we've never met any of them. But I do think that this is the really important move, not just in enhancement, but in lots of emerging technologies. Is what are the bounds of this technology that a society can permissibly accept under conditions of pluralism as we understand them within political philosophy? Now, really interestingly, Michael Moeller has recently started to do work on what political philosophy looks like under conditions of what he calls deep pluralism, because he's a German living in Virginia, and he's discovering what deep pluralism looks like. I think that, and so there is progress to be made in political philosophy as well, but I think this is a really important thing. Not should we X, but what would X look like if we were to do it, and how do we make that happen in a way that can be politically justified, but also represents the way that we understand the relationship between peoples. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. That was great. I think this is at least tangentially relevant to what you were talking about, but how do you think about the question as to when a collective obligation translates to an individual obligation? So people will talk about climate change and how obviously we have a collective obligation to mitigate it, but I know there are some people, Walter Sinnott Armstrong, I believe, makes this argument that says, well, yeah, that collective obligation doesn't necessarily translate to an individual obligation to drastically reduce your carbon footprint or something like that.
Yeah, no, I have a couple of students doing stuff on climate change right now, and a lot of what we talk about is, actually the first place that I start them is the idea that the climate footprint was a concept invented by consultants working for BP, right? Because the sociological purpose of that move, right? I'm not saying that this is like a philosophically rigorous one. The sociological purpose of that move was to individualize and what the Europeans would call responsibilize climate change, right? To make it about individual decisions. I think that climate change is a collectively held duty, but I don't think that instantiates in an atomized, aggregate set of individual duties, right? And that's in part because the kinds of polluters that are actually doing most of the work are not individual polluters, right? Number one polluter in the world, the people who give me a lot of money to think about philosophy, that are U.S. Department of Defense, right? And then it makes even less sense to say that an individual Marine, right, has a responsibility to reduce his carbon footprint in Kabul or something like that. It's like what does that even mean? So yeah, I think that we can have, and moral philosophy I think gets really tripped up in this because we want to be able to say, right, if we have these imperfect collective duties, right, how does that instantiate an individual responsibility? Whereas political philosophers, to a certain extent, don't have to go that route, right? Instead, they can say, what is a structure that would obviate these kinds of risks, and how does that square with certain kinds of democratic freedoms that we think are more foundational, right? I have a student to finish this anecdote up who is currently doing work on fashion, and the idea that a lot of environmentalist movements adopt a very what he calls pro-poverty mindset. So their entire stance is just individuals should just have fewer things and do less, and do fewer things and have less stuff, right? Which he is kind of mounting an argument is something that actually has let the fashion industry off the hook, right? And so he's talking about the fact that we have these like really reductive aspects of like the human experience that are constrained by certain kinds of environmental rhetoric that also obviate the larger social questions about what should we be doing about the creation of, like, you know, the environmental impacts of indigo in like blue jeans factories in China. So I think that political philosophy can help you get out of that individual to collective move that moral philosophy often wants you to take.
Do you, just as a quick follow-up,
Yeah.
do you think there are some cases where there are, like, for example, some collective action problems where there is some individual obligation, as well as the kind of structural need for a solution to help mitigate the problem? So
Yeah.
the one that I have in my mind is parents choosing to give their kids cell phones at a young age. And it's kind of collective action problem where they don't want to, but all of their kids' friends have cell phones, so they feel like they just need to give their kid a cell phone. How would you think about that example in terms of the individual obligation that a parent might have?
So that's really interesting, coming at a moment where the place that I come from, I was going to say my home, but I have two passports. So Australia is currently debating banning access to social media for people under 16, I think it is, right? Just like outright, like, Twitter was a bad idea. Twitter was a mistake, and we need to stop children from having access to it. So again, that's a way to take that collective action problem and institutionalize it, right? And Americans, and there's a whole bunch of interesting political and historical reasons for this.
Sponsoring people for Australian citizenship?
I did actually think of a scheme that involved like a mail order husband kind of gig. When my wife's friends started to ask, are there any single Australians just hanging out there? And I'm like, well, I mean, just like every other country, yes, presumably. But getting them here is extremely expensive. I'm a very expensive import. So you can institutionalize that from the outset, right?
Yeah.
But this comes down to this kind of liability and incentive problem that is where I think political philosophy actually can kind of step in and like alleviate some of our burden, right? Because I presume the reason that you don't want to give a child a cell phone is because you don't want them to have access to social media, to be on the phone all the time. It's actually less about the phone being a telephone and more about the fact that we now have supercomputers that also happen to be telephones in our pockets. And then you have this competing incentive, which is, well, he's got social stigma or she has social stigma because all of her friends have phones. We live in a world where there are now normative expectations about being able to access people at all times. I have colleagues who get very upset if I don't return their emails on times, which, being an Australian, makes me not return their emails even harder than before. And, you know, people have these real concerns about child safety these days, which I think to a certain extent are overblown, but are also a very real thing, because again, you don't want to be the parent of the kid who got kidnapped and didn't have a phone on them, right? No matter how minuscule the chance is that your kid's gonna like toddle into a white van of some kind, right? You know, the way that we imagine it on television. No matter how tiny that chance is, you don't want to be the one parent who had that happen and also was the one parent who didn't have a phone, right? So there are immense social pressures. Part of the way of doing this is by establishing communities. So I know parents who are part of communities of parents who collectively have kind of agreed, right, that we don't give our children phones, right? So one of the ways to do that is to establish community. The other way would be to institutionalize it, right? But even then, you could imagine that, like, and I think this is like one of the ways practically out of these collective action problems with individual instantiations, is that to try and merely go it alone is not the first response you should have, right? In terms of strategy, right, outside of the realm of moral philosophy, right, in terms of strategy, right, the first thing you should do is try to create coalitions, right, because coalitions are much easier to actually get things done with than just individuals deciding to do it. It works in international diplomacy, and it seems to work with parents. I wouldn't know, I'm not a parent except to cats, and I don't have to give them cell phones, which is really great. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought this was a fantastic paper, so I'm very grateful. I wonder how you would think about some possible objections to the shift from ethics to political philosophy in this context, or from applied ethics to political philosophy. Let's call one of them a realist objection and the other a conservative objection.
Mm-hmm.
So the realist objection would be something like, you have your Rawlsian political philosophy for deciding about the lab in JP, but the Chinese have a nationalist political philosophy for deciding about the lab in X. and by adopting the Rawlsian one, you would be putting yourself at a potential disadvantage in an arms race kind of scenario vis-a-vis the Chinese, and therefore you should be careful about taking an institutional political philosophy kind of approach, because these kind of questions operate in a global rather than in a local context, even if you could agree on the relevant political philosophy.
Yeah, so, and then what's the conservative objection?
The conservative one, I think, is, which I think actually as a matter of culture you're going to get. I think it's less persuasive, but it's the fact that the move to institutional considerations from applied ethical considerations trains us in a sort of deficiency of agency. It trains us not to take, sort of
personal responsibility,
et cetera.
Gosh, I'm just kind of clearing all of the things I want to say about libertarians from my head. There we are. All right, I'm done. No, I mean, one of the things that surprises my students, because, coming with the accent that I have, they're like, oh, well, you clearly must be a socialist. And I'm like, well, actually, yes, but that's has nothing to do with my accent. That had to do actually with moving to the United States of America and becoming extraordinarily radicalized by the horrors. So to the realist objection, I mean, one is that, like, I could kind of be sneaky and just say, well, debates about realism are also part of political philosophy. So no matter which way you go with this, you're still coming onto my turf, right? Because one of the things that we do when we think about cosmopolitan political philosophy is that we have to kind of ask how states should interact. But even if we're not cosmopolitans and we still kind of accept like the Hobbesian account of the international sphere, states still have to make decisions about how much they're going to invest in national security over other competing political priorities within their government, right? And one of the kind of effects of securitization of issues is that it feels like it always puts an existential finger on the scales when it comes to technologies, right? God forbid that we stop, like OpenAI from creating Skynet, because what if China creates Skynet first, right? No one destroys the world but America. What is it? Don't let someone else ruin your life. Be a man. Do it yourself. So we could have that realist discussion, right? And we could decide, well, is there like a transactional way that we can go around this? So we can think about access and benefit sharings at the international political level in the biology case, and in the AI case. Is there a way to use convention, right, and to use norms at the international scene? People have a real trouble with the UN because it feels like it doesn't get anything done. They often forget that the US kind of designed it that way, as did the Russians and the French. But it also does get things done in the sense that, in my world, in biological disarmament, the norm against biological weapons has been upheld with only a few lapses for a half century now, right? Which is a long time for states to be like, you know what, we're not going to do the bad thing. So I think that that's totally compatible with my theory, is the philosopher's way that I sidestep around that. And then the other way that I would think about the conservative objection is actually about libertarianism, right? I think it's really fascinating that we think about personal responsibility for technologies, but we don't actually have like a robust account of a libertarian approach to technology, right? I mean, in some ways, Robert Heinlein was doing more work on libertarianism and technology in the 1950s than anyone since, right? And I think it's really interesting because I don't think that the non-aggression principle, right, of like the Butchkin, kind of Nozick, Hayek kind of stream of libertarianism, I know that there are others, I don't think the non-aggression principle has a good account of like some of these second-order harms that emerging technologies have, right? Or it's going to run into Susan Muller-Okun's objection to libertarianism, which is, all right, so for the students who don't read the minutiae of some of Okun's work, so Susan Muller-Okun is a feminist political philosopher, most famous for her objections to the way that Rawls centers his political philosophy around the family unit. And one of the objections she has to libertarianism is that libertarianism, especially out of the Lockean strand, has this idea of productive labor and ownership, right? So if you put productive labor into something, then you own it, right? And she looks at children and she goes, Who puts productive labor into children? People who have uteruses. Does that make it yours? And it's like, that's a fatal objection in some ways to libertarianism, because you're meant to be a free agent, and yet someone made you, and thus you belong to them on the theory of property, right? And so a libertarian argument around heritable germline editing would be a fascinating, inquiry, right? What does it mean to say, I didn't just birth you, I didn't just front up the biological machinery to make you, I designed you, right? What does that mean for my relationship to a child, right? So you can be like a status socialist like me over one end, right, with his nonsense views about free healthcare and free education and all that other good stuff. Or you could be like a hard libertarian and you could actually ask the question, right? So I don't actually view the conservative objection as an objection at all. I would be like, hey, come play, right? I want to see what Nozick has to say about artificial intelligence.
There's a paper from Rebecca Roach called Reproductive Altruism, procreative altruism, because it's a response to creative beneficence.
Yep.
Parents should be thinking about the interests of their kids. And she says, no, you should be thinking about the interests of society.
Right.
And right now, with all these arguments about why people should be having more kids, it's like you're putting a moral obligation on people, usually libertarian-leaning people, saying you have an obligation to have kids for society.
And there is a moment in the debate about heritable gene editing back in the Human Genome Project days where we didn't know how genetics worked, which was a problem. So Joel Feinberg, who is actually a fairly strong, he's a liberal, I think, for the most part, but he has some real libertarian leaning tendencies if you read harm to self and harm to others. So he's often credited for coming up with a child's right to an open future as a concept. So this idea that one of the problems with genetic engineering is that if it forecloses certain opportunities that you would otherwise have in your life, right? If your parents engineer you to be a math savant and then you wake up one morning as a math savant and you're like, God, I really wish that I'd been able to enjoy art, that you have arbitrarily foreclosed on a child's future. And that's to a certain extent, I think, a libertarian move by saying, look, non-aggression applies to future persons, right? And it applies to their ability to have these certain kinds of opportunities. So I think that one of the cool things about that conservative response would be that the objection is really, the response to the objection is really sure. If you want to do conservative political philosophy, but you're still playing this game at the end of the day, rather than, because you still have to have a perspective on the state. And a perspective of hard personal responsibility is really a perspective on what the limits of the state are, kind of by extension. Yeah. Actually, no, you had a hand first.
Go ahead. I have a quick question. I'm trying to understand the kind of how radical the critique is.
Mm-hmm.
Because at some stage I kind of heard you say you kept applied ethics as it is, autonomous, and then there was grumblings it's it's either incomplete or less important than other stuff. And other times you seem to be challenging the kind of autonomy of that applied ethics as well. So I was trying to
I mean, I think that this is probably a rising tide lifts all boats kind of situation, in that I think that applied ethics still does good and important work, especially around value theory, right? So Pat Lynn is one of my mentors, and I think that one of the things that he does really well is he rocks up into a new technological space and he lays down here's the terrain, the value-based terrain, and what we should think about, and then he walks off into the sunset because he doesn't want to do anything else in the topic, right? He writes his 3 papers and he's done. Where is he now? He's a space cybersecurity is his current thing. I'm like, good for you, buddy. But then there come all these questions that I think some are really important applied ethical questions, and then some are, and this is in part a sociological response to the way that biomedical ethics in the US in particular has evolved, which is that as someone who comes from outside the United States, you often arrive in biomedical ethics, and they're talking about triage, right? And how should we expend healthcare resources? And I'm like, my country solved that. We just did. That's why Australian bioethicists don't talk about allocation of resources the same way that Americans do, because we have universal healthcare, because we're just well, maybe everyone should have it. Solved. So there are I think the answer to your question is going to be it depends on which applied ethical discipline we're talking about, right? I think journalism ethics actually does a lot better role of political philosophy than biomedical ethics in some ways, because people who do media ethics and journalism ethics are already like entangled in the right to free speech, right? So they're already they have one foot in philosophy of law from like day one. Biomedical ethicists will do anything to avoid talking about politics. Anything to avoid talking about politics. There has been rumblings recently that AI ethics has been so captured by the tech sector that there is a really radical move to be made, because we're so hyper-focused on like what should individual coders be doing that we've totally forgotten like all of the larger substantive questions. And I don't want to say that biomedical ethics has never thought about this. Obviously, just up the road we have Norm Daniels, who like this has been his entire thing, right? But you know, he's what, 84, right? He's going to kick the bucket, you know, eventually. And there's not really anyone who's been doing the kind of work that he's been doing in the same way. Global justice obviously has really strong political philosophical roots. Pogge, Wenner, Illingworth, Barry, right? So I think that it really depends. Like, at the moment, I'm just doing like applied ethics writ large, right? But I think with this paper, one of the things I'm going to have to specify is that because applied ethics is not a monolith, the strength of these kinds of questions and objections really depends on which kind of applied ethics you're doing, right? I guess the last one to talk about would be like the ethics of armed conflict, where, I mean, they've been thinking about the state since, what, Aquinas, at least? So like 1,000 years of political philosophy thinking about armed conflict. And so they have a really strong relationship with international humanitarian law as a result. And they're not writing papers like have been written in the last year around public health ethics, where they're like, what is the responsibility of individual public health officers in a pandemic? To which my response is often, that seems like a meaningless question in a lot of ways, or at least a deeply incomplete question. Yeah.
So, and I'll preface this by saying, personally, coming from a ideological position of a real dyed-in-the-wool social democrat,
Right.
who admires a lot of what your country's done, you know, Centerlink, living the dream, right? But
I don't know about that, but yeah.
So, jokes aside, libertarianism has been brought up so many times in this discussion. And despite my own political orientation, over the last few years, over the last maybe, let's say, 4 or 5 years, it seems to me that there should really be, especially in the United States, sort of there should be more consideration of libertarian thought. However, not this, what some people have called, like what Murray Bookchin called proprietarian thought, this libertarianism that reduces all freedom basically to the contemporary legal definition and conception of property and money, Rand Paul, the American Libertarian Party, etc. And instead maybe use the libertarianism of Bakunin and Goldman, libertarian socialism, where it's, you know, the group is not free unless the individual is free and so forth. So my question to you would be, do you think some of these kind of ethical questions, especially in regard to the creation of technology that could be liberatory, that I think, like I mentioned Bookchin, I think Bookchin actually talked about a long time ago.
Post-scarcity.
Post-scarcity, anarchy technology as liberatory. Do you think there should be investigations of these questions of maybe potentially liberatory technology from this kind of left libertarian perspective?
Absolutely. And when I teach Intro to Political Philosophy and we get to libertarianism, one of the things, because UMass Lowell takes kids from New Hampshire as in-state tuition, so we have a lot of libertarians in my classes. And one of the things that I say is, look, I want I want to separate libertarianism as a political philosophy from libertarianism as a bunch of questionable ideas about marijuana and the age of consent, right? That's one kind of libertarian that lives in New Hampshire, and I care about a different kind of libertarian. So I actually use Bookchin and Bakunin as like interlocutors in that, right? Because I don't just want to teach them Nozick. I think that this was done, right? And I think that one of the interesting things about ICT ethics as the progenitor to AI ethics, right, is that when computer ethics, so he just died actually, Jim Moore just died. So when like Jim Moore is writing about computer ethics in 1984, right, there is this entire strain of political thought around computers which is ostensibly liberatory, right, and kind of then reaches its like pop culture apotheosis in things like The Matrix, right? And one of the critiques of that is that the left libertarians did not have an account of political economy in the United States post-Cold War that was able to survive the kinds of utopian ideals that they had, right? So Adam Curtis, who's a British documentarian, has a bunch of documentaries on this. One of my favorite kind of feeling sad about the state of the world kind of watches. And I think that this like left libertarian exploring the liberatory potential is really, really interesting, especially when you then combine it with like the successors to Haraway and like feminists kind of like cybernetics theory, or like the current like renaissance in like trans philosophy, right? There are all of these liberatory projects that are happening right now that philosophy of technology can bear on, but I think that we should keep in mind that like the naive left libertarianism of the 50s and 60s might need to be updated, not just with libertarianism, but also with like revolutions in anarchist thought, right? And so I think that like anarchist theories of technology are really, really powerful here. And they do exist, but they don't tend to exist within philosophy departments as much, right? I'm reading a book called, it's called The Shadow of Justice. It's by Catherine Forrester down at Harvard, and it's a historiography of Rawls and what he did to political philosophy, right? And kind of like the ascension of liberalism in mainstream analytic political philosophy. And I think that you would find a lot in there about like where some of these ideas have gone as a way to reintegrate them into, I'm not trying to say that like political philosophy of technology should be Rawls and technology, right? That sounds like a very boring course, right? And I love Norm Daniels' work, I really do. I think that I'm talking about political philosophy in like the most expansive way possible, right? About the way that technology and our social order come together.
Yeah. I have a comment on like incentives versus risk.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is talking about like the political justification to subjugate certain like vulnerable groups with the reward of possibly helping others.
Yeah.
And I think an interesting way to think about it is in Boston, for example, we've had a massive influx of Haitian migrants coming into the state. And there has been a push to open up more centers for them to live temporarily. And what happened over the past year is there was a lot of attempts to use space in like suburban communities to house these people. But obviously this kind of like NIMBY like pushback was very much like taken seriously. So what happened is Governor Healy used a community center in Roxbury.
Yep.
And the community was obviously rightfully upset about it because there's so few spaces in that part of Boston that can kind of be a safe place for people to come together and benefit from. So I just wonder like if we're basing that off like the right to be able to have like third spaces or like to feel safe or whatever, I guess it kind of comes down to the questions like whose rights are we taking seriously? Because we obviously have like an understanding of who's, I guess, worthy of not being exposed to the risk. Like if we're using the argument that, and I don't believe this at all, that migrants are dangerous, which is like this massive rhetoric that people I think are really falling into now. And I know the answer to this kind of, how are we deciding who is worth taking on this like hypothetical risk?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that outside of technology, political theory and political philosophy can answer a lot of these questions, or at least give us a principled basis for thinking about the appropriate distribution of risk and benefit in society. My university has had a conference center and hotel. That conference center and hotel was donated to the state for the purposes of housing Venezuelan refugees and migrants. Now Lowell is 20% Cambodian, 12% Puerto Rican, 8% West African, it's a majority minority city in a lot of ways, and as someone who came from Southeast Asia, I'm all for it, because getting pad thai elsewhere in America is just the worst, which is an extremely white boy thing to say, but it is extremely important. Pad thai is extremely important to me. But one of the interesting things there is that the only people who were harmed by giving over that space was the University of Massachusetts, right? And in fact, there were a lot of objections to the existence of that hotel and conference center right downtown because it had removed space that would otherwise be used for living by marginalized groups, because there are laws in Lowell around Section 8 housing, around affordable housing, around rent control, things like that. So I think that this is an eminently plausible way to use political philosophy to think about who benefits and who is harmed by these structural changes that we make. A really straight kind of difference principle approach, which is a bit of a mangling of the difference principle because it's not meant to be used at this level. But you could think about prioritarian uses of space when we're thinking about refugee communities, and the fact that poor communities with limited access to services should be the last group of people to have to give up their access to services, because a straight homogeneous redistribution of migrants in the state is always going to hurt poor communities more than it hurts rich communities. I think it's Jim Childress, actually, when they were talking about organ lotteries, often said that randomized distribution is really just injustice with extra steps, right? Because if you're just randomly distributing across a population, what you're always going to end up doing is hurting one group of people who already had more to lose more than the other, right? So rational choice is preferable to lotteries in those cases. And yeah, we should absolutely be prioritizing, at least on kind of these prioritarian accounts, you should absolutely be prioritizing better off communities, right? In my own work on technology, there's a really great book by Kwame Etta called Rights in Transit, which is a history of the extensions to BART, the Bay Area Regional Transit Lines, and the ways that NIMBYism, transportation is a really interesting interface for this, because rich people want access to transit, but they don't want it too close to them, right? So they don't want it so close it's going to affect their property values, but it has to be close enough that they don't have to drive very far to get to it, right? Which is why you end up putting BART lines through poor communities so they can get to the rich communities, also they're available to the rich communities, but they're not actually, no one's having to give up their green space in the nice parts of the Bay Area, right? The same thing happened with the interstate. The same thing happened with the Washington Metro, right? You can look at the way that we prioritize people in distributing risks and benefits in technology spaces through transit. I think it's one of the best ways to do it, because it's concrete in a way that pharmaceuticals and medical care are not.
All right, my friends, I want to be mindful of the time. It's 2:30. Nick, this was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.